afternoon, everyone, and welcome back. 我们今天下午这一场呢是讲缅甸，那么缅甸场应该是大家非常兴奋，也很伤心，就是曾经兴奋过，然后又极度的这个失去希望，现在挫折感很强，我们都跟着缅甸的全国同胞哈，还有尤其是民主人士，非常的挫折。曾经看过一点点的烛光出来了，那现在连烛光都没有了，现在就被吹熄了。而且一世英名的翁山书记，今天我们也落了下场，我们也感到非常无限的这个唏嘘啊。好，那我们今天就来谈谈今天下午这个缅甸场的主讲人呢。坐在我右手边的Thompson Chau 我们欢迎他。我来介绍这个 Thompson Chau 周浩霖。Thompson Chau is a journalist covering news in Taiwan and Myanmar. He is Frontier Myanmar's corporate director and editor-at-large, and also regularly writes for Nikkei, Asia, and The Economist. After more than 5 years reporting in Rangoon, he relocated in early 2022 and now spends most of his time in Taipei, Bangkok, and Chiang Mai. In April 2023, Thompson was elected president of the Taiwan Foreign Correspondents Club, TFCC. He is also co-recipient of the 2021 Vivian Wu 应该是吴舜文，是不是？是哈，吴舜文 Award, which is a very prestigious award. Congratulations. And he has written for the Financial Times, Al Jazeera, and Telegraph, and other international outlets. Previously, he was the chief reporter and associate editor of Myanmar Times. Outside journalism, Thompson used to serve as a board director of a foreign chamber of commerce in Myanmar and was a member of the British Club in Rangoon. He has a MA from the University of St. Andrews. I believe that's in UK, right? Okay. So, and then he will spend 50 minutes to give the speech for the Myanmar situation, which I don't think is a present one, and hope you can cheer us up and see how the prospect can be and how can we, from far away, can hopeful. I don't think we can help much, but we can hopeful. Yeah. Now, I'm very glad also to introduce to you all the respondent, 回应人。回应人是杨志强先生。杨志强，他在研究所的时候是主修国际关系，他曾经立志要做外交官，然后但发现呢他的外向性格，不过他的外向性格不是做外交官，真的吗？外交不是外向吗？对不对？他觉得他的性格不适合在公部门工作，所以在2013年呢，毅然决然的，这个不是他写的哈，是我讲的了毅然决然的，转而从事外电新闻的编译工作，其实编译工作其实是很内向的，不是吗？对不对？你不能够很外向，把那个翻译都翻成你所要讲的话，对不对？好，2016年呢，成为独立记者，报道足迹，包括内战时期的书单。这个要作为一个 world journalist 真的不简单，我非常的佩服，因为我常常看 CNN 啊或者 BBC 有一些这个战争的有战争他就去，那种还有电影也有演过，那个的确是需要非常超人，有特殊秉义的那个特性的人才能够做 world journalists 啊，那大家知道吗 ？Michael Chinoy。以前 CNN 的 reporter 对不对？他在20年前李登辉这个96年的这个危机的时候，他来访问我，然后他经我一讲呢，他有点失望，他说真的没有战争啊，所以我说 Why you are looking for war in Taiwan and this is my job， look for war. And I said, you can look for war, but you cannot hope for war, right? 所以他是很坦白。那么他的爸爸呢 ，Charles Chinoy 是 University of Washington Seattle 的一个社会学家啊，所以我们也就谈到他爸爸。所以他访问过，他去这个报道苏丹、孟加拉跟罗兴亚的难民营以及缅甸等这些国家，带回台湾新闻较少关注的区域冲突、战争、人权议题。后来他加入报道者，不过我告诉你最新的状况，刚刚几分钟以前，他说他刚刚离开报道者，你们还不知道哈？他说现在是 freelance， 这真的是外向。所以曾经参与废墟少年专题报道等，现为报道者的，应该还是特约记者吧？特约记者没有错啊，所以我们欢迎他。那么他有15分钟的回应啊，那请各位跟我一样来，我们欢迎这个 Thompson Chau to give his talk.
Thank you. First of all, thanks for the very kind introduction and the invitation to speak today. I would find it rather impossible to cheer everyone up, but I will try to spice things up. And I think that's why we see my presentation headline today, Myanmar, the Other War Exploited by Moscow and Beijing. I think there's not much else that I can introduce myself on, but I think a quick background is I lived in Yangon. I first arrived in Myanmar in 2015, and I joined as a journalist in 2016. So I was there, I would say I've seen the sort of best of times, one of the most challenging times during the Rohingya genocide, and then also the worst of times after the military coup. So today I want to quickly talk about the whole overview of Myanmar, and particularly what's going on in the country in relation to the big powers of China and Russia, and how journalists, including both foreign journalists and local Myanmar journalists, are covering the situation. I also want to quickly talk about, highlight the point that now being in Taipei, it feels very much like what Taipei is to the China journalist community is what Chiang Mai in Thailand is to the Myanmar-focused writers as well. But first of all, a bit of recent observations from Thailand, where I just got back a few weeks ago. So there's actually more than just Myanmar for the Thai elections. Here you see I penned a piece with Al Jazeera about how the Thai elections might change their position on the Myanmar struggle. Prayut, the outgoing prime minister and the former army chief, is known for his support and on a very personal basis with the Myanmar junta chief Min Aung Hlaing. But it's more than that. I think on the right you'll see that Thanathorn, the former leader of the now disbanded party, the Future Forward, when he came to Taiwan last year for the Oslo Forum, he sat down with us to gave us an interview, and how he talked about why the struggle in Taiwan, the struggle in Myanmar, and also in Thailand for democracy, for freedom, they're all interlinked. And there he also warned about how Prayut is drawing Thailand closer to China, and also drawing Thailand closer to the Myanmar junta. And I think at the end of today's presentation, I'll move on to talk a bit about the election result and how many Myanmar people I know have some hopes on the situation going for the better now that they might have a new government in charge in Bangkok. I think numbers speak for themselves. So this is a quick overview of what's going on in Myanmar. I think for those who may not be as familiar about the country as some of us who have been covering it for a few years, Myanmar had 10 years of relative economic and political reform. Before 2020, it had spent decades under successive military regimes where some of you might have heard of the struggles of the past where they put Aung San Suu Kyi in jail. They refused to recognize the 1990 election result where Suu Kyi and her party, the NLD, the National League of Democracy, won. But to move forward, they had 10 years of relative reform. And in the last 5 years, Aung San Suu Kyi shared power with the military. So when there are some noises around the region, or there will be some commentaries, particularly in the Chinese-speaking world, you see some Chinese commentators saying, oh, maybe she tried a bit too far in democratizing Myanmar. That cannot be further from the truth. She spent 5 years sharing power with the military according to the constitution written by the military. So during those 5 years of so-called elected civilian rule, we have a quarter of the lawmakers in parliament who were appointed by the military, and the three most powerful ministries being controlled and appointed by the military and not by the elected government. The border affairs, which is basically the biggest of Myanmar's problems, dealing with all the borders with neighboring countries. The home affairs, which is running a lot of local offices across the country, and also the Ministry of Defense. And here's a quick overview of what the numbers that helps explain what's going on. After the coup, the economy shrunk by almost a fifth, and now it's sort of gone back to being stagnant. It's quite astonishing because Myanmar actually grew during 2020. So when the whole world was contracting economically during the first year of COVID-19, Myanmar grew by a healthy number, a healthy digit, and then it shrunk by almost a fifth, 18% in 2021. As you can see, we also see there's a severe humanitarian crisis going on, more than 1.3 million people displaced, and around 18 million people in desperate need for humanitarian aid. These are the numbers from the UN, and they are not, random numbers come up by people. It's sort of professional United Nations experts who have spent a long time looking at what's going on the ground. And of course, today is a journalism conference, it's a journalism forum, so I want to also highlight that Myanmar is also the world's second biggest jailer of journalists after China. So that's, if you look at per capita, it's a lot even more than what the Chinese government has been doing. So what has been in the news so far? Here I listed a number of regular occurrences we see in international media. If you look at the global media, the newspapers, the broadcasters, these are the typical news we see, once a month, once every 2 months about Myanmar, particularly about arrest and sentencing of Aung San Suu Kyi, executions of political prisoners last year, which I noted that I note that the Taiwan MOFA also condemned, the spiraling humanitarian crisis, and also what we see is what follows after all these airstrikes and bombing would be a lot of condemnations coming out. The UN condemns that, the US is strongly appalled, ASEAN usually takes a few days before they come up with whatever they want to say, and it's sort of a cycle where Myanmar in the international, particularly Western media, is being portrayed as a story of a hopeless, chaotic crisis that, we can't help it. This is how it is. It's sort of complete mess. There's no solution ahead. So I think this is part of the narrative that when I spoke to a lot of Myanmar contacts, politicians, activists, and analysts, they feel a bit frustrated about. They think that Myanmar is not in a hopeless state, it's in a revolution stage. But the international community, particularly including the international media, haven't really been able to see that through. There's also, I would like to also explain what's going on. I think it sometimes takes a bit of time to understand. So I think most of us would know during the last 50-odd years, Myanmar has embraced what they call the peaceful resistance. So it's similar to the movements we see in Hong Kong, in Thailand, in Cambodia. People go to protest, some people go on strikes, but it's all very peaceful. And Myanmar has given that quite a chance. They have tried for 50 years. But what happened in 2021 and I was on the streets with many of my colleagues looking firsthand, when the soldiers took the guns out to gun down young people and civilians, like not unarmed civilians and even pregnant women, there's a big change of attitude. And the movement essentially thinks, well, we have tried to peacefully protest and ask for democracy for so many years. And then again, they took the guns out. We've seen this before. Our dad and mom have seen this before. Our grandmama, grandpapa have all seen this before. And so there's a big turn, and many people embrace the armed resistance. So now Myanmar, the movement now they are split into two. It's in parallel. They're not mutually undermining each other. They work together. So on one hand, you have a very strong, peaceful resistance. A few days before I left Yangon to fly to Taiwan to relocate here, I saw after I left, there was a big silent strike, and that means the whole city, Yangon, 7 million people, no one went on the street, or at least almost no one ever go on the street to show the military that we are not happy with your rule. So this is a very powerful symbol of peaceful resistance. It also takes place in many other forms. There's still a huge civil disobedience movement within the government. So civil servants, people working in train stations and public services, they go on strike to deny the military control over the state machine. And by doing so, the military is not in charge of the economy, they are not in charge of the government services, and that denies them the legitimacy that the military wants when they talk to international stakeholders. But meanwhile, if you see on the left, that's Dua Lashila, that's the acting president of the underground government, the National Unity Government. 我觉得中文我们应该说是这个缅甸的全国平行政府，或是全国团结政府。So he's the acting president, and he showed up in one of the borders to give a talk and look after some of the PDFs, the local resistance forces, who do not belong to any ethnic armed groups. They are young people who got fed up with what's going on, and I mean, some of them I've met before. You know, they used to play iPhones and Huawei before, but after the coup, they would go into the jungle, learn how to train and take up arms, and now come back to cities and rural areas to have their fight. I also want to emphasize how different this is. This time is for not just Myanmar, but for the region. I think when the military took their guns out at first, many people I spoke to, you know, foreign embassies, diplomats, analysts, they all think, well, you know, the guns are out. If you look at history, the movement will have to die down within a few months, because the fact is that, I mean, they're really harsh, so there's no way you can push back. But we are more than 2 years since the coup, and the movement is still as strong as ever. So I think times has changed. There's also an age of social media and technology. So the movement is now using technology to fundraise online for the humanitarian crisis, trying to bypass the restrictions imposed by the military. And they've also used social media. I think in the past, when, you know, military shot down someone, a correspondent, someone will write a story, and then we file, and then we move on. But now, or we write a book of 10 years later. But now, you know, anything happens. I was covering a story for Nikkei, I think just 2 months ago in Sagaing, there was a horrific airstrike in Sagaing against civilians. And so immediately you see all these horrific photos being out on Twitter, on Facebook, being circulated by a lot of people in Myanmar, and these photos get spread outside the country. So I think that also affected the situation a lot. The regime can't just say, oh, it didn't happen, then move on. You know, people looked at it. If you are in ASEAN, if you're part of the region, you look at what's going on in your neighboring country, and you probably want to say a few words to your government about it as well. And I mean, I'm from Hong Kong, so in Hong Kong, we have a phrase called 好像七國這麼爛，七國咁亂. So to quote several of my analyst friends, they say if you're trying to understand Myanmar, it's essentially like China's seven warring states a few thousand years ago. Essentially, the junta has not managed to control most of the country. This map here, it shows of varying colors. It shows you the scale of the armed resistance against the Myanmar military. So the deeper it looks, the more incidents they have. And if you look at it, basically more than half the country have more than several serious armed incidents against the military within 6 months. And they've also noticed this chart was published just 2 months ago. And the analysis is last year, there were even more incidents than the year before, the first year of the coup. So instead of calming down, the movement have shown, the fight has shown no signs of calming down. Quite the contrary, you see there are more and more fights and battles on both fronts. And I can quickly here also explain, if you guys look at, if all of you look at the borders, so that's Myanmar, China's on the right, India's sort of on the northwest, but also on the far left, because there's the ocean and Bangladesh in between. And then in the south, that's Thailand. And so Myanmar's being really sandwiched between 3 pretty powerful and strategic areas, India, China, and Southeast Asia. And here, most of the borders essentially are controlled by, they are not, and they have never been controlled by the military. They have always been controlled by the ethnic armed groups. In Myanmar, there's a debate about how we call them. And today, for language sake, I would just call them the ethnic army. So they're actually different sorts of ethnic armies. I think in Taiwan, people might have heard of the Hua state, Hua Bang. So that's the bordering China and Yunnan. And basically, they're their own states. If you are a Myanmar citizen, you can't even go in freely. They speak Chinese, they use the renminbi, they use the Chinese telecoms network. So we see that now Myanmar is exacerbating this trend that I think a lot of the ethnic armies could be potentially consolidating their hold over the territory. So what is the regime's response to all these opposition from young people, from ethnic armies, from the underground government as well. There are essentially two approaches. One is sheer brutality. So on, I think everyone here can see on our left, that's the photo taken by one of my good friends and colleagues, Guy Dinmore, in his story recently. It's called Fallen Spring Stars. So it's by AAPP, it's one of the rights groups that documents Myanmar citizens who lost their lives because of the coup, but not just now, even for many years before the coup, they keep documenting people who paid their lives for the movements they have because of the conflicts, etc. So here you can see, I mean, many dozens of faces there staring at all of us here. It is in the border town of Mae Sot, just inside Thailand, beside Myanmar, in southeastern Myanmar. And this is an exhibition dedicated to victims of successive revolutions against the military since the first post-independence coup in 1962. And here you see rows of faces and names stare out from the walls, including pictures of some 30 civilians, and among them 2 Save the Children charity workers, who were tortured and burnt alive in what is now known as the 2021 Christmas Eve massacre in Kayah State. And on your right, you can see, well, there was the earlier photo of people protesting peacefully in Yangon. And then below, that's the point I think a lot of people want to highlight, is the junta now is relying on sheer brutality. So it's no longer just gunning people down. If we found that your village is sympathetic to the opposition, or that your town is potentially sympathetic to activists, then we would just bomb you, bomb the entire village, airstrike the entire town. And so this particular story in Nikkei Asia is just 2 months ago. It's one of the deadliest attacks so far. They've been sending a helicopter and fighter jets to bomb a village in Sagaing. So that's the Burma heartland. That's literally in the middle of Myanmar. So it's not one of those remote border towns. And that killed almost 170 people, including around 20 children and 27 women, according to one count. And this is not the first or the second time. I mean, even a few months before that, there was a big bombing against a concert in Kachin, where they just fly the jets over and bomb the whole concert in the middle of the music and art, and killed all the artists and civilians as well. So I think the military has shown that whatever your opposition to us is, and however powerful and successful you are, we will not think twice before using brute force to really quell all the opposition. And the fact is, in the last 2 years, all these aircrafts have been supplied by both China and Russia, and they haven't stopped supplying the military of all these. So I don't think anyone's expecting this to stop until something changes. For example, aviation fuel gets sanctioned, or China or Russia stop supplying the Myanmar junta with arms. And that brought me to the second. Point. The first point is the military is very good at using brutality and sheer brute force. The second is they would try to wear you down. So now we are into our 3rd year of the coup. The battle is still going on. You see a very strong underground government speaking up for the people of Myanmar. But the fact is the regime will try to continue to use guns and airstrikes and wouldn't do much about the humanitarian crisis. And then at one point, they would say, let's have an election. And let's have no illusion here. The election is used to design to entrench their rule. I think sometimes when I go to travel around the region, people ask me, oh, is it similar to other regimes we see in Asia? I think this particular election is uniquely different, as in you have the entire ruling party by Aung San Suu Kyi in jail right now. Others are in hiding because they know that if they get out, they will get jailed or tortured or killed. The regime executed and admitted publicly, despite everyone from Taiwan to ASEAN telling them not to execute prisoners, they publicly executed NLD members last year as a show of force. And so with all this going on, there's no way an election, whatever form it takes, would be either legitimate or fair. And I think it's not even about legitimacy or fairness anymore at this point. It's about can the military host an election in a country when it doesn't control around half the country? What would happen if they force people to vote? And that has been a concern. If you look at the World Bank report this year, the first time they warned about the risk of violence escalating further. Because what might happen is the military may take the guns out to force voters to go and vote for their own people, in order to show the world, well, we have at least 30% turnout, or we have 80% turnout. So this is actually a very worrying situation. And I think I also want to highlight a point that in March, the military disbanded and dissolved 40 political parties, including Aung San Suu Kyi's NLD. And these 40 parties together won 89% of seats in the 2020 election. So essentially, the military is abandoning and the military is dissolving everyone else, almost apart from their own proxy party. And so the question for us here is, how do we get to this stalemate? I think if you ask many Myanmar friends, they would really not like the word stalemate. They would push back against the word. They think, one of the analysts told me the important thing is it's a revolution happening, there's an uprising. And when you look at a revolution, you do not look at who's going to win at the end. You don't just look at who's going to win at the end. You look at how the revolution is also transforming the country forever. In terms of there's unprecedented unity among different ethnic armed groups. There's unprecedented unity among people of all ages and faiths, Muslims and Buddhists and Christians working together. I mean, united by a common enemy. So I think here I want to quickly quote two of the people I know, two diplomats in the region that I think really spell out what's going on. So one of the ambassadors in Yangon told me the vast majority of people in Myanmar want one thing: the military stop running the country, but they can't get what they want, and the world hasn't done much either. The reason we are in this stalemate now is Myanmar's not really seen as a big priority for the West, led by the US, to really do more than just sanctions and non-lethal assistance. So my understanding is that Myanmar has been asking for much more support, and always, you know, if you talk to Myanmar, some of the politicians, they will say, well, if we have only 1% of what the US has given to Ukraine, we would have toppled this war already. But for the West, they simply do not see this as a viable proxy war. And of course, there's also the China factor. The West fears that if you send in much more support or even lethal assistance to the movement, China would probably, has a likelihood of intervening, maybe even militarily, because China really sees Myanmar as its backyard. So even back in 2018, when the US ambassador at that time flew to Kachin State to talk to the Kachin ethnic communities about peace, communities, humanitarian crisis, the Chinese ambassador got really pissed off, and he flew there the next week to tell all the Kachin people not to meet the US ambassador. And that turns out that backfired quite badly, because the Kachin attendees actually leaked the whole meeting to the media, so we got hold of what happened. But I think also beyond the West, there's also two other things. China and Russia are effectively backing the regime. So the regime, even though they're losing a lot, they have lost unprecedented amount of control and territory over the country, but they know they're still backed by the two big powers in the region. And while that's going on, countries including ASEAN, India, and Japan are very, very lost on what to do. So the West has at least provided sanctions and in some way supported the movement, but countries like India and Japan and South Korea and ASEAN are quite lost on what they could do constructively in this crisis. And I think that there's one thing they've done, which I think I need to also bring up. I don't want to paint them as sort of not doing anything. So Japan, Korea have allowed the NUG to set up an office. So there's an office in Tokyo and Seoul. I don't think there's one in India. Thailand has turned a blind eye to a lot of activists and even politicians who have stayed in and fled Myanmar and stayed there, including some pretty senior contacts. So I think Thailand's position so far is, as long as you don't talk too much, we will just turn a blind eye and let you stay there. But if you're too high profile, maybe we will deport you back. So this is essentially the so-called stalemate. And of course, this is, it adds, what doesn't help is this regime is very different from the regimes in the past. I mean, Taiwan, also, of course, with the whole KMT history with Myanmar, I think almost 100 years ago, more than half a century ago. We know what happened in the past with Dan Shui, with all the dictators in the past. But this lot is different. This is a quote from one of the Asian embassies. He said, whether you talk or meet up or whisper to the current regime, to the general, the problem is that they don't listen. So all the efforts to essentially bypass the sanctions and try to talk to them by regional countries, by Southeast Asian countries, by Thailand, by India, it hasn't really shown any changes. The regime has continued to execute people and kill people in airstrike villages. So that also presents a unique dilemma for a lot of governments in the region. So this is a quick overview of, you know, I want to show you this photo. Russia is now the #1 supporter for the Myanmar junta. But again, you know, it's sort of more political. I think at the end of the day, China is the country that can really shift the balance of power or give effective pressure against the Myanmar military. This is quite a funny photo because Myung Lang went to the Russian university. It's the military university of the Ministry of Defense of Russia, and they conferred him an honorary professorship. But apparently they didn't know his height, so they give him this very, very long robe, and he ends up looks like one of those Hong Kong zombie movies with the sleeves way more than his arms. I can't share this in Myanmar. I think I'll be arrested if I share this photo. But so this is this is the recent visit by Qin Gang, the new China foreign minister, to Myanmar. It's the first time a Chinese cabinet-level foreign minister goes to see the junta chief of Myanmar since the coup. So China has stayed away for 2 years, not meeting Myung Lang, and now they have really effectively moved to, like it or not, they are recognizing it. I think there's a debate about how much China likes that to happen, whether they are reluctantly backing him or actively embracing him. But I think the fact is they are partnering with him now. So I think this is a very good quote from another diplomat I know for many years. He said this time is different between the movement and the junta because China and Beijing and Moscow are providing tangible support for the junta, whereas those who support the resistance, for example, Western countries, are more rhetorical in their support. And this is from Scott Marcial, the former US ambassador to Myanmar, Indonesia, and ASEAN. The next one is, I want to quickly dive into this since we're in Taipei talking here. Why does Myanmar's crisis matter to us in Taiwan? So here, the UNODC, Jeremy Douglas, who's a big name on opium analysis and drug trafficking, has very good points in it. The coup affects all of us. We're all in the region. I mean, number one point in Southeast Asia already is you're feeling the problem with drug trade. And here he said, virtually all the drugs reported, heroin reported in East and Southeast Asia and Australia originates in Myanmar. And the country remains the second largest opium and heroin producer in the world after Afghanistan. So having the coup, having the entire chaos that a regime that's unable to govern or control the country and anything at all, or the borders, have actually brought in many, many more problems for the region. And I think we're in Taiwan, so we know we have enough problems on our plate without another crisis. Beyond that, there's also the, I think some of you here may know the scam problem, a lot of human trafficking problem. I actually interviewed one of the Taiwanese victims who was trapped in Cambodia, and I think one of my colleagues also talked to someone who got trapped in Myanmar as well. So having a regime that's unable to do anything apart from shooting and airstriking means that you have a lot of these transnational crime, drug problems, human trafficking. We all know the scandemic that Taiwanese and Hong Kong and other citizens got scammed and basically kidnapped to Southeast Asia. And again, the crisis is part of the problem. And of course, from the Taiwan perspective, that's beyond just all these very practical issues. Taiwan is a vibrant democracy. Now Myanmar, we have a country where it's bigger than the UK and France added together. The landmass is not small at all. It looks small because it's in between India and China, but actually Myanmar is not small. And now you have this vast country being forced back to a dictatorial regime that is fully aligning with China. I mean, if you look at Taiwan, if you look at others who believe in democracy in the region, is that good news? Does that help Taiwan's cause? No, it doesn't. And of course, beyond there's also the, I showed you guys the map just now, there's also a unique strategic value in Myanmar. The west coast of Myanmar would allow China to access the Indian Ocean. So China and Myanmar are now trying to push forward the railway, highway, and the Jiaopio port in Rakhine. I think Chinese call it Ruokaibang. They're trying to build the deep sea port there. And if it is built, I don't think it will be anytime soon, given the conflict, but if the junta one day managed to win and build it, then that could be quite a big problem for, quite a big boost for China, because China no longer relies all the imports and fuel from the Strait of Malacca. And I think the Thai people get it. So, the one thing that the Thai election once, the Move Forward Party from Pita, once they won the election several weeks ago, they have publicly said that they would support the ASEAN position on Myanmar, provide humanitarian corridor to the Thai-Burmese border. And this is the thing that's also very, very worth highlighting in geopolitical level. The Pita, he also publicly said that move forward, the new government would support and work with the US on the newly passed US-Burma bill. And that's one bill that I understand that China's really not happy with, because China misunderstood the bill as a foreign meddling, even though China influences more than half the ethnic armies in in Myanmar. But China was like, no, US, you can't have this bill. That's my understanding. And I think to go back to journalism, since we are the conference here, I'll repeat what I said earlier. What Taipei is the China journalist community is what Chiang Mai is to the Myanmar-focused journalists. So many Burmese media outlets, the Irrawaddy, people I know in Myanmar now and other companies, not just Frontier, but also a lot of the other media outlets, foreign journalists working on Myanmar for many years, have now all moved to Chiang Mai. I also want to emphasize that Myanmar writers have paid a much, much higher price. I think you all may have heard that my colleague Danny Fenster, the US journalist, got arrested and spent half a year in insane prison in 2021. That was a very high-profile case. Even Secretary Blinken mentioned his name and urged the junta to release him. And we got lots of envoys and politicians to bring up Danny's case. But what's less covered and paid attention to is the very high price the Myanmar journalists have paid for their work. And so this is one of my colleagues who actually, right after Danny Fenster's release from Yangon and the military deported and sent him back to the US, a month after, Yimon, one of my old colleagues for many years, he was beaten up and sexually abused by the regime soldiers in the end of 2021. And at that time, we couldn't even tell anyone, he couldn't tell many people. It was a very horrific incident. And if you look at the level of crime the military is willing to do in order to scare people off, in some ways is effective because this is a pretty horrifying experience. And to his bravery, Yimon stayed in Myanmar for several months and then quietly left the country last year. So now he's abroad, he's came out in public with his name on. And in this story, in Frontier, he told his story of being raped and blindfolded and beaten up by soldiers when he was in Yangon airport. I also want to share, in Chiang Mai, Frontier, we have also created a greenhouse. We launched a greenhouse a few months ago. So this is a new space designed for exiled artists, activists, NGO workers, and researchers. So we're doing workshops there, art exhibitions, hopefully one day, language classes. It provides a safe space for those who have all exiled to Chiang Mai from Myanmar, who think about their families, who think about their countries all the time. And there's a place for them to sit together and talk things through, and also have fun and not always talk about the conflicts. If you ask me, will journalism on Myanmar survive? Would local Myanmar journalism survive? My answer is yes. And it's not just about Frontier. I mean, the Irrawaddy and Myanmar Now and others are doing very, very good work as well. Frontier Now is the same for everyone. Basically, there are no advertisements since the coup. There's zero advertisement revenue. The grants are drying up. So media outlets who are exiled to Chiang Mai, who are already struggling with how to operate from there, the safety issues, the visa issues, they have to cope with the longer-term challenge is how can you make sure that your pockets don't dry up and you still have money to feed, to give it to your employees so they can feed their families. So in Frontier, for example, we have built this membership program. We launched it a few years ago. So embassies and people and whoever wants to support journalism, whoever cares about Myanmar, they pay per month to join and read ours. For the public interest, we kept most of our stories to public. We don't paywall them, but we provide newsletters and analysis, and we keep them to the paid readership. And that's how we hope to strike a balance between opening up to everyone and maintaining the public interest journalism, but also trying to make some money and survive. And we also do events. So we do regular hybrid panels and webinars to really get people to talk. So last month when I was in Thailand, we got the former Thai foreign minister, Kasit Paromia, and a few other VIPs to talk about the crisis. And Kun Kasit is a very experienced ambassador, so he talked about when he was in ASEAN, what he did, what's next for the crisis. This is a bit of interesting snapshots of history in the past. I talked to Letitia. Letitia van den Arsum is a former Dutch ambassador to Myanmar and Thailand, and is a very renowned diplomatic expert in the world as well. I asked her about how it feels like back in the past, because I think in Taiwan, having all the China writers coming over is relatively new. In the past, usually when you have to leave China, you go to Hong Kong for a few years and then try to go back to China. But in Myanmar, it seems it's a bit more similar to the past where, and here Letitia, she talked about how back in the 1990s that it's the same. Whenever she went to Yangon, and I quote here, it felt like a dark curtain closed behind me. I felt completely isolated. I had my first ever mobile phone by then, but it was useless in Myanmar. And the Thai border was just as important then as it is now. There are a large number of refugees were in camps on the Thai side, and places like Mae Sot were visited by many, just like today. So this is some of the insights before. But also she added, there are also a lot of fundamental changes now. And I mentioned some already, for example, social media, how people get the news out so much more quickly than before, and how young people who have had 10 years of relative freedom are not willing to give up what they had. And so some of my last slides here, this is one of the first stories that I wrote for Nikkei Asia back in 2021. When Taiwan, we used this photo when Taiwan passed the first parliamentary resolution condemning the military coup with cross-party support. I think the question for Taiwan now is, look, I mean, I think if you talk to any Myanmar context, they understand Taiwan's dilemma. Myanmar people understand Taiwan. There's some things that Japan and China and others can do that Taiwan can't, and Taiwan already has your own challenges and problems. But I think at the minimum, a lot of Myanmar people are hoping that Taiwan can really try to investigate and prevent any military links, business links with the military. So there was a former UN expert report, I think half a year ago, naming Taiwan as one of the countries that has companies with links to Myanmar junta companies. I've put a question to MOFA, actually, the Foreign Affairs Ministry. They asked me to ask the Economic Affairs Ministry, so I asked the Economic Affairs Ministry, and I haven't heard back. So if there are any journalists here, maybe you can help me follow up with them. I think also the next question is, for Taiwan and the rest of the world, is how do we face this election? Do we all try to make sure that it's okay and endorse it and move on, or try to move on, even though the military is still killing everyone? Or do we sit down and have a proper conversation about how to approach this crisis? How can we bring about effective change on the ground? And how can we bring about accountability as well? So these are the two of the people who have publicly called on Taiwan to reject the junta's election recently. I have to make sure that, no, Joseph Wu hasn't said anything. I'm trying to get him to say something, he hasn't. So there's Liz Truss, who was, when she was here 2 weeks ago, she told us that she would urge Taiwan to really join the UK and others to call out the shambles. And on the right is Dr. Sasa. So he is one of the cabinet ministers of the NUG, who is now still in the country, I think, or at the border. And so he's been very, very active talking about the region. And I think the next slide will show you there's a quote from him. But it also affects Taiwan just more than a crisis in the region. The military and the USDP, the militarist party, have shown a very strong tendency to really align themselves with China. So when Nancy Pelosi came to Taiwan last year, the militarist party, the political party, publicly accused Nancy Pelosi, Speaker Pelosi, of destabilizing East Asia with her visit to Taiwan. I mean, that comment actually raised a lot of eyebrows in the Myanmar circle, because they were like, you produced the most refugees and drugs in the region, and you're accusing Pelosi and Taiwan for destabilization. And I think I will end here with the last quote here that you guys feel free to look at. So Sasa just a few months ago publicly urged Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, and others in the region to reject the junta's polls. And he said the only way these polls would benefit the junta is if the world endorses them. So we call on Asian governments and others to preemptively call them out. And I think basically that's all for me today. I think the message is very clear. The Myanmar battle is not over. We shouldn't treat that as a hopeless battle. There's hope. It's a revolution. Whatever you stand as journalists, as activists, as news researchers, I think we should all continue to support and pay attention to the crisis going on. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Thompson. And you give us a very clear and though depressing, yet with a little bit light, a bright thing. You say journalism will survive, which I want to ask more later, how journalism in Myanmar can survive. If more than 20,000 people are arrested, and how many of them are journalists, and how courageous the Myanmar journalists can be, and that is to be the test. OK， 我们现在在欢迎这个杨志强先生，来跟我们做回应，好吧？你有15分钟。OK，
大家好，我是杨志强。那我今天可能就是用中文来跟大家分享啊，非常荣幸今天可以在这边可以跟大家分享，尤其是跟好朋友 Thompson 在同一场啊，因为刚才 Thompson 讲的比较是以大方向的角度来看现在缅甸的状况，然后想跟大家 小小的补充一下，现在缅甸正在发生什么事情。所以我题目就是以缅甸的武装反抗，还有罗兴亚人他现在长期被大家遗忘，那他们现在到底的状况是什么样子？第一个，其实刚刚 Thompson 有秀出一张图片，其实这跟刚才那张图片差不多。左边这一张呢是在政变之前，政府可以控制缅甸的区域的图，所以红色的地方就是缅甸在政变之前可以控制的地方，所以还是有一点小小白色的地方，他们是没有办法控制的。但在政变之后呢，其实他们可以控制的地方就更少了，大多数它是集中在像是一些大城市曼德勒，然后奈比多或者是仰光，所以你可以看到，在一些丛林或者是在边境的地方，它大多数都已经被反抗军或者是刚才Thompson 有提到的，就是民族武装组织所占据。那我们来看一下现在他们两边对峙的状况大概是怎么样。现在缅甸的国防军加上武装警察大概有14万人，然后现在所谓的 PDF 就是民众起义的军队呢，大概是6万5千人，这个数字是在去年统计的。然后这6万5千人，它其实是散布在缅甸各地，它并不是一个完整像国军或是美军或是缅甸的国防军这样，它有一个完整的组织的部队，并不是，而是许多民众他们自愿加入这样子，就是刚开始的时候上街抗议，发现没有用之后，他们决定放下大声公，然后进去丛林里面拿起枪。所以这300个营呢，一个营大概是200到500个人，然后散落在各个地方。然后再看更细一点，其实这300个营里面，只有20%的人他们是拥有制式武器的，然后只有40%，因为他们连制式武器都拿不到，所以他们必须用土制的武器。然后最后呢，这个60%拥有武器的部队里面，只有一半是全武装。全武装什么意思？比如说这个营里面有200个人，但他只有100支枪，也就是说，他并不是每个人一个人都有一把枪。所以你可以看得出来，这一支PDF 它的武装力量其实是相对于缅甸政府军有很大的差别。下一个 slide 可以看得到，在政变之后呢，缅甸军政府从外国引进来的引进来的军火大概是10亿美金，而这些军火就跟我刚才讲的那些枪啊、手枪啊、步枪不一样，它主要的是飞机、大炮，还有像图片上面这种多管火箭。所以那从这个地方又可以看到，因为反抗军他们就顶多是 AK-47或是 AR-15这种步枪，但是在政府军这边呢，就完全就是飞机大炮。所以其实看刚刚那张图，你可以看到，多数的反抗军他们还是在丛林为主，因为如果你要集结大部队去攻击城市的话，对于现在的反抗军来讲，几乎是不太可能的事情。但另外一方面，政府军想要用大量的轰炸，或者是直接进去丛林里面扫荡反抗军的话，它其实也有很大的阻碍。好，除了刚才提到的 PDF 这样子的军队之外呢，它其实现在还有2支比较小的部队。第一个是叫做 Local Defense Force (LDF)， 它跟 PDF 比较不一样的地方是，因为 PDF 它现在目前是只属于 NUG， 就刚才 Thompson 讲的那个平行政府，它是受 NUG 领导的。但是 LDF 它比较像是地方的民兵部队。然后它的组织就比较松散，而且它的那个武器呢，就没有像刚才所说的，有20%的制式武器。他们的领导也不是由 NUG 来领导，而是由像是有时候会有一些 activist 或是地方的一些领袖来作为领导。然后他们人数每一个小队大概就是数十到数百人。但是在这2年下来呢，因为 NUG 它是希望将这个武装反抗做一个比较有系统性的，而且比较有规模性的来反抗，所以他就慢慢的去吸收这些 LDF， 所以到目前为止已经有25%的 LDF 加入了 NUG， 加入了 PDF， 慢慢的接受他们的管控。然后最后一个部队叫做人民防卫队 PDT， 他所做的事就跟拿起枪反抗有很大的不同，而且他们的人数大概在全国大概只有2000人，然后一支小队就10几个人，不会超过100人。然后主要的工作就是维护当地的治安，或者是运输补给资源给 PDF， 然后再加上 PDF 多数都是在丛林里面，所以当他们需要跟城市里的人民或是城市里的反抗者 联络的话，就是由 PDF 来PDT 来做这样的事情。然后我在上个月的时候，我有去刚才 Thompson 提到的那个泰国跟缅甸的边境，有一个小镇叫做美索，那个地方其实有很多的缅甸反抗者，他们逃离家乡，然后到那个地方去 settle down。然后那时候我采访了一支小支的 PDT， 就是那个后援部队的这种，里面我采访了4个人，他们整个队伍里面大概有10多个人，然后这些队伍他们已经被通缉，所以多数已经跑到那个美索来。他们那时候就跟我介绍说，他们做的事情是什么。大家可以看到上面这4张图，上面这2张呢，就是在香港2019年反送中时期，他们其实很多的反抗者用了大量的 Telegram 的这个通讯系统来跟所有的反抗者来通讯。其实，在左边这一张呢，是那时候大家可以看到，它是香港地图，然后在那个时候它是可以 live 的呈现哪里有水炮车，哪里有警察，哪里有武装部队，然后让反抗者可以知道要去哪里躲，要躲在哪里，不要特别去哪一些地方。然后在下面这张图就是我刚才就是在上个月采访那个 PDT 他们所做的图，然后这个图就是在仰光。他们那时候也跟我讲说，他们为什么会这么做的最重要的原因就是看到了香港之前怎么做，所以他们就直接整套搬过来。然后他们也是一样，在哪里就 live 的呈现，哪里会有 checkpoint， 哪里有警察，哪里有武装部队，然后大家要小心。然后右边这个呢，其实就是 Telegram， 它所提供的讯息，虽然说没有像地图一样这么明显，但是它可以提供的是更细节的讯息，比如说在哪一条街的街口有几个人出来，在哪一个城市需要多少护理师，然后在哪里有 checkpoint， 然后那个 checkpoint 会不会 check 你的手机，有的会，有的不会，它的这个给予的讯息就更细节。所以这2个东西的辅佐呢，就让就是现在在反抗的反抗军，它多多少少有一些可以互相连接，可以有更完整的资讯。好，那我们再回到武装反抗的地方，刚刚其实有提到，就是 PDF， 他们其实多数呢都是学生，或者多数都是年轻人，或者多数都是从来没有打过仗、没有拿过枪的人，只不过现在他们发现到和平抗争已经没有用了，所以他们才躲进那个丛林里面去反抗。但是他们没有枪，没有训练，该怎么办呢？所以这些 PDF 大多数都会跟就是刚才提到的民主武装组织合作，由这些长期在跟缅甸政府对抗、打内战的民主武装组织来教授他们如何打游击战，然后并且给他们，因为他们都在丛林里面，然后都有营队嘛，所以就这个地方去训练他们，然后甚至跟他们一起合作进行一些军事行动。当然，民主武装组织的武器也不是源源不绝的，他们人力也不是源源不绝的，尤其再加上现在因为乌克兰战争爆发之后，国际的 focus 全部都移到乌克兰去，对于缅甸这边的进展其实都没有太大的关注，然后再加上没有国际的支援，刚才他们也提到，如果有1%的那个军援武器到乌克兰可以转向到缅甸的话，那就会有很大的不同，但是没有，所以他们怎么办呢？他们必须要第一个，这些 PDF 他们就跟刚刚提到那些民主武装组织购买武器，或者是跟他们租武器。我有听过，就是在克伦的一支 PDF， 他们因为没有武器，所以跟克钦独立军借了1000支 AK-47，就是为期是2到3年，然后多少钱？但是这未来会怎么发生，我们也不晓得。他就是合约到了，要还给他吗？不晓得，现在还不晓得。然后另外一个方式就是他们开始做土制的武器。这些土制的武器就不会是什么 AK-47、AR-15这些东西，就多数像是猎枪、散弹枪或是一些简单的步枪。然后在去年的统计呢，在缅甸全国大概有70间的土制武器工厂。然后最后一个 ，OK， 你跟民地武买不到武器，你自己制作武器又太慢，那怎么办？那你只好跟黑市买。但是在黑市购买武器呢，其实是非常贵的。那时候我也是听到一个消息，就是说，因为如果你要走私武器进去缅甸的话，多数你都要经过泰国，要不然就是要经过就是一些边界，因为现在的港口都是被军政府所控制，所以你不可能直接进去里面。但是泰国的军政府跟缅甸的现在军政府是好朋友，所以他们对于这些 把武器输送给他们呢是非常管控非常严重的，所以他们就会收非常多的回扣。如果你在一般的像在美国啊或在哪里买一支 AR-15的话，其实最多就是$1000到$1500块美金，但是在泰国的边界，你买一支 AR-15就要1万美金，所以他们就趁机去剥削这些。那这些要买武器的钱从哪里来呢？其实刚才 Thompson 有大概提到，最多的大多数的武器都是由大多数的这些金钱呢都是由海外缅甸人所募资，然后捐给 NUG 再拨给 PDF 去买这些武器。但是在去年的时候，他们总共募得了$5500万美金。但是大家记不记得我前几张 slide， 其中一张 slide 是缅甸军政府他买武器就花了10亿美金，所以这个差距是10万8千里，是差很远的。虽然说在这些实体上的差距有很大的差距，人数的差距、武器的差距、资金的差距，但是有一个东西 PDF 他们是占绝对的优势，就是从政变一直到现在2年多来呢，在缅甸的政府军我自己听到的就有几百起的逃兵，有的人说是1000起，但是因为这个东西很难证实，缅甸军方他也不会公布，所以但是逃兵频传这是绝对的。然后另外一个就是 PDF 它是广受到缅甸民众支持，但是这个因为军政府他们也知道他们是广受支持，所以常常会比如说他们到了一个村庄，然后说我怀疑你去支持反抗军，那他就开始屠杀或者是开始烧房子，然后想要利用这种残忍手段阻止民众继续支持 PDF， 但是其实它发生的效果是反效果，因为又激起更多的民众不满，甚至让更多民众愿意加入 PDF。所以最后来到这一张图，其实也是想要提醒大家，其实跟 Thompson 刚刚的最后一个结尾是一样的，就是 Myanmar's fights keep going on。他们就算是没有那么多钱，没有那么多武器，但是他们一点一滴的慢慢的把这些土地拿回来。其实你可以看到这些白色的地方它其实是一点一滴的慢慢在增加，然后在国防军的部分，他们是越来越多人开始逃兵，越来越多人开始甚至跳出来指责国防军他们对缅甸民众做了些什么事情。好，那我接下来再快速的跟大家汇报一下那个罗兴亚人现在的状况。这一张statement 呢是 NUG， 也就是平行政府，他在政变之后7月的时候，他所释出的那个 statement， 很特别的是，因为在翁山书记主政的时候，其实他们也是不承认罗兴亚人的存在，甚至连 Rohingya 这个字的使用都是不可以的。我记得 Thompson 那时候我们有讨论过，因为在之前他也在那个 Myanmar Times 的时候，他也跟那个他的 editor 去讨论说，我们到底要怎么样去描述 Rohingya 这个字？但是很特别，你可以看到，在这个 statement 上面，他就直接写出了 Rohingya 这个字，所以也就代表说 ，NUG 现在对于罗兴亚人的态度是，他希望在现在就是把所有的少数民族或是所有的民族 treat equally。其实最重点就是，我自己听一些缅甸朋友讲了，第一个他们讲了2个原因，第一个就是因为他们现在终于知道被迫害的状况是这么的辛苦，因为以前罗兴亚人被迫害，然后现在他们受到缅甸军方迫害，所以他们开始理解为什么罗兴亚人会有这么激烈的反应。然后第2个原因就是他们不希望罗兴亚人跑向军方那一边，所以其实就大概是这2个，我自己所知道是这2个原因。好，现在但是罗兴亚人他其实到现在，就算是 NUG 写出一个 statement 说 OK 我们承认你，但是到现在呢，罗兴亚人他还是流离失所。在2017年的时候，因为发生一个种族清洗，所以有73万的罗兴亚人逃离他的家乡，然后现在还住在就是缅甸跟孟加拉的边境，大概有100万人。然后刚刚其实 Thompson 有提到，在去年的 UNODC 报告里面呢，有大量的冰毒它流入孟加拉，那为什么呢？你可以看到在左边这个地方，它其中一个方向就是从缅甸，然后经过若开邦进去进去孟加拉。而这个地方其实为什么会变成一个这么大量的最大的原因，就是这些毒枭就利用罗兴亚难民的弱势，因为他们在这些难民营其实已经3到5年的时间，所以他们状况其实非常不好。 然后他们又必须要求生存，然后所以就会受到毒枭的引诱，然后变成运毒贩。另外，罗兴亚人在2019年的时候，因为有100万人现在在孟加拉，然后孟加拉政府他们当然也要 deal with 这个问题，所以在2019年的时候，他们提出来一个，我个人认为是不怎么明智的政策，就是希望把罗兴亚人全部移到一个小岛，就是在吉大港外面的一个无人岛，叫做腾加查尔岛上。在2019年就提出来了这个政策，但是一直没有执行。但是最后面在2021年底的时候，他们第一次试办移了18000个罗兴亚人到了这个小岛上面。大家可以想象吗？这个小岛它原本是无人岛，然后18000个罗兴亚人被移过去，因为那个地方他们就有建立了一些像是木板屋的那种住宅，让罗兴亚人住在那个地方。然后移上去的时候就发现了2个问题，因为部分罗兴亚人他们也不想要待在那个难民营里面，所以在想说 ，OK， 孟加拉政府有提供我们一个新的住处，那好啊，那去试试看。结果现在发生什么状况呢？几乎所有罗兴亚人都想要回去难民营，都想要离开这个小岛，因为很大的原因就是上面几乎是零工作机会，因为它本来是无人岛啊，它怎么可能会有商业行为？所以是没有工作机会。当然，这些罗兴亚人可以待在政府所提供的住宿里面，然后也有3餐，政府会给予3餐，但是他们不可以离开这个岛，因为孟加拉政府会怕所谓的难民涌入孟加拉，所以他们几乎，我自己的判断，我自己的诠释就是，它是一个开放式的大型监狱，因为在监狱也是有饭吃啊，所以在那个地方，罗兴亚人现在就是他有饭吃，但是他没有工作机会，但是他又不可以离开那个岛。所以现在发生什么事情呢？有很多罗兴亚人会跟人蛇集团合作，或是不是合作，就是请人蛇集团帮助他们，或者是人口贩运者帮助他们离开这个小岛，回到之前的难民营去。所以罗兴亚人从以前到现在都一直在逃跑，逃离孟加拉逃离若开邦，然后逃离难民营，现在又要从现在从这个小岛逃出来，逃到其他地方。然后在今年的4月呢，这个悲惨民族他们又遇到了另外一个天灾，就是有一个大型的飓风刚好去袭击了就是缅甸跟孟加拉的边境。大家要知道，在这个难民营里面，他们所住的建筑都是以竹子，其实那个图可以看到，用竹子还有防水布所搭建的，它是非常非常脆弱的。所以那个时候，飓风进去的时候，就造成当地有很大的。对于一般的缅甸人，他们住在那种水泥住宅的话，可能不会有太大的影响。但是对于罗兴亚人的难民营来讲，有很大很大的影响。那时候我就直接去联系了还住在那个地方的朋友，然后他们就传了很多影片还有照片，跟我们讲说现在在那个地方的状况到底是怎么样。然后因为其实罗兴亚人到目前为止，虽然说 NUG 已经承认说未来要帮助他们，但是现在的缅甸政府还有孟加拉政府对于他们的生死其实没有给予太多的帮助。好，那最后也回到就是我们今天的主题，也就是 generation。我记得在缅甸的政变刚爆发的时候，因为那时候我在台湾，然后我就是用越洋采访的方式，用电话、用 Line 用那个网络的方式去采访当地的记者。我记得那时候 Thompson 还在缅甸。那时候仍然有一些外国媒体还待在缅甸，所以那时候讯息还是可以出来。但是不晓得现在我们还进得去吗？就是当外国媒体，我们还进得去缅甸吗？我们进去缅甸可以采访吗？采访到什么样的程度？或者是还有多少外籍媒体现在还在缅甸里面？那他们要怎么做采访？他们必须跟军政府做出一些妥协吗？还是怎么样的？这是想对汤姆森先生的提问，谢谢。
非常谢谢杨志强先生的回应哈，也提供了蛮多的我们以前好像知道一点，现在知道多一点了啊的有关罗兴亚的处境还有武器从哪里来。我看到这个资料，我也很惊讶，看到我们都知道中国跟俄罗斯都提供武器，他这里也提到新加坡。也许你可以解释一下，那新加坡的立场到底是什么？新加坡不是 就不是有很义正言辞，每次碰到事情都好像自己很有正义感的样子。可是呢，很多事情他又不敢讲。那在这里他不是双手吗？啊，也许这个新加坡是第一次我听到，哦，也许你可以解释一下，在你的 PowerPoint 在大家看看这个 pamphlet 的第71页啊，这个 it's a shocking news. Singapore is selling weapon to the military government. OK， 作为主持人有个好处啊，因为这个就坐在他们旁边，所以我可以就近的先问一两个问题，然后也许带起一些讨论哈。The things that you mentioned that Russia and China did the tangible things, helped the military government. But the rest of the world are still only serving the lip service and also rhetoric. Why so? Why is the case like that? That I think will be interesting for us to, maybe you can elaborate more. And also you mentioned briefly, hinted that some Taiwanese business has linked to the Honda business. Is that true? Okay, maybe you can elaborate that.
Hello, okay. I want first of all the brief answer to the links. That's not from me, that's from the Special Advisory Council in Myanmar. That's the UN expert body. In their report, they named Taiwan as one of the countries with links. I already asked the Taiwanese government for a response, so I think once they finish their investigation, they'll get back to the media, hopefully. I think you raised a very good point, a very good question about inertia. Why is the region not doing more for the movement, even if when we look at Japan, Taiwan, India, democracies or semi-democracies? I think one is they got trapped in the very traditional foreign policy view. The view in New Delhi, for example, or even Tokyo is, oh, if we do more for Myanmar, we would distance the junta more and Myanmar would become a Chinese proxy. Well, I mean, one is Myanmar, so the junta at least is already becoming a Chinese proxy, like it or not. And the other is they also, the way they look at Myanmar is more like, there are lots of interests when you take a foreign policy position. And I think one of the interests would be commercial interest. And I think for some countries in the region, they have been heavily influenced by corporate interest who want to go back to business as usual and shake hands with the regime.
We know that the ASEAN countries believe non-interventionism. And so from your understanding, how much that ASEAN countries think Thailand, you say Thailand may change a little bit, but if Thailand change, that means you violate this or non-interventionism. How far can Thailand go? And don't mention about rest of the ASEAN countries. So that's what I have been observing the Southeast Asian countries, the 10. Whenever there's a bad thing happen in one of the country, the rest of the country keep silent. They don't say anything. They don't make judgment to other country so that you take care of yourself. Now we are out of it. So how long this non-interventionism can go on and so that the unity can be like a Hippocratic unity? To me, it's a Hippocratic unity. I'm sorry to say that. Yeah. But what is your response?
Yes, I think that's a very good observation, a very shrewd observation. I think today we also have other speakers from on the Philippines and Indonesia, so maybe they can also offer some view a bit later during that session. I want to quickly point out, you talked about the, yes, ASEAN is split. First of all, ASEAN is heavily split. The problem with Thailand right now is not because they have broken the so-called non-intervention. It's more because, look, in 2021, the entire ASEAN bloc agreed to not invite the Myanmar junta. So they say no political representation from the junta in our meetings. The problem now is Indonesia's chairing ASEAN. They rotate every year. But Thailand has gone bypass ASEAN to do their own regional meeting with the junta, together with India and China and Cambodia and Laos. And now that presents an almost existential challenge to ASEAN because you have a big member of the bloc, a member state, who actively and publicly is seen as at least undermining the consensus in ASEAN. And I think the hope now is if there is a new government in Thailand, they would work more with Indonesia and other countries to really have a united position. And I mean, I don't think there's anyone in ASEAN talking about sanctioning the military or whatnot. No one's talking about that. But the hope is they would have a bit more effective pressure on the military to tell them you need to stop doing this before you want to get back to us on the table.
梁先生，你觉得那个新加坡那个事情，你解释一下，能说多少算多少？
新加坡政府他们有自己出来解释，对他们有说那个是私人公司所做的这些事情，跟新加坡他自己就是他的官方是没有关系的。然后另外一个有趣的数据是，我记得新加坡在缅甸在翁山书记政府时期有很大就是。这个数据可能要再找一下，它是排前几名的一个大力投资，它就是跟缅甸有非常，也不能说长期，就是在翁山书记政府时期，它是一个很大的投资国。这个可能说不定那个 Thompson 知道他那时候是排第几名，我记得应该是前3名。
The floor is open, and we still have around. We finish by 4:20, so we have about 15 minutes. Okay, now floor is open. Please ask questions. Mr. Burma is in our heart. We need to, yes, go ahead, yes. Identify yourself, please.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you, Thompson, for your presentation. My question is, with so many reports of violence in Myanmar, how do you keep people from getting desensitized with these reports on violence? Because I think our experience, for example, in the Philippines during the drug war is that during the first few months, there are a lot of international coverage because there are so much deaths happening in the country. But after a few months, like, they are so used to the violence and they are so used to all these killings that when they heard another report about killings in the Philippines, they don't really care. So how do you try to keep the interest by not focusing on violence when you know that the violence is still there? So how do you keep the people not getting desensitized by the violence, by the reports of violence? Okay.
We'll pick up more questions so that the two speakers can answer, okay? Yes. Yes, go ahead, please.
I'm Kenji from UK. You know, my big question all the time, not only for this time around the Myanmar junta doing such atrocities to their own people, they have been doing this for years. I mean, what are to both of you, what do you think is the deep down reason behind Myanmar military able to kill their own people so easily, so much, so many times? I mean, you know, PLA has killed so many in Beijing in 1989 and in other places. But as you said, in the jailing number of journalists being jailed in the country, if you take per capita, it's a lot more in Myanmar. I think if you take per capita of killing their own people by the military, I think the Myanmar military really sticks out. Would you please, you know, sort of give us an analysis of why? I mean, the Myanmar military is so able to kill their own people for so many different reasons. Yeah, that's my question. I have others, but yeah, I'll keep it to one.
来，后面有没有？左边、右边、中间？没有，没有的话，我们先这两个问题，那我们请 Thompson. I think you are the one. Shall answer the questions.
Sure. I think on the first question about being desanitized about it is a challenge. I mean, if you ask me, those who cover the news share the same challenge as you guys and others who cover conflicts. I mean, you look at Ukraine, you look at what's going on in the news. This also has a change of perception since the first year. I think in Myanmar, it's partly helped by it's not a comparison to the Philippines, but I think in Myanmar, compared to, for example, China, is helped by the very porous border. So you do get a lot more information out, and it's not just about the atrocities. It's about, for example, what is going on, what is the military trying to achieve. So you get that geopolitical angle as well with the Chinese visit and the Russian support. But it remains a big challenge in how we keep the attention alive. I think that's why we have this forum today. And I think a quick response on the question about the military. Look, I'm not a Myanmar military expert, honestly, but from what I know, I think two backgrounds explain their operations. One is they have never stopped fighting since independence. There was, when I talked to one of the decades-long analysts on Myanmar, and he speaks fluent Burmese. He said, if you look at the independent stage, and then they have the KMT along the border in Yunnan, and they have the Communist Party of Burma, and more than once they almost went all the way to the Burma heartland. And so that fear of outsiders and interventions very deeply embedded in the Myanmar military. And then if you look at how they grow up, they are sort of really cut off from the rest of society. Many of them have their own quarters to live in. They have their own schools. The soldiers' wives hang out on their own. I mean, I don't really see any of them in my last 5.5, 6 years in Yangon. So they really have their own world, and they live in their own bubble. And I think that explains. And I think on top of that, what we see now is a combination of brutality and incompetence. You just don't know how policies are made. I've spent many time as a journalist to ask people, embassies, scholars, even Burmese business people, you know, why would they announce this policy today? And they were like, we have no idea who did it. So I think that that's a combination of incompetence and cruelty.
Have Myanmar military kill more people of their people than PLA?
What I'm saying that if you take a per capita, like, you know, when
Per capita.
when Thompson was given the example of the number of journalists being jailed, and number one is China, number two is Myanmar, but he said, I mean, if you take that per capita by population, yeah. So I mean, China has so many people, right?
So I cannot say next, you know.
Should I use English or just? OK， 我用中文好了，中文可能表达的比较好一点。回答就是这位先生的问题，就是其实我们自己在做这样的报道的时候，也会有这样子的 concern， 说到后面我们一直重复，也不能说重复，一直在报道类似嘛，就是一直 violence 下去，它没有太大的改变的时候，那我们该怎么办？我自己也在想这样的问题，因为最近在想说，哦，要去采访缅甸，要去缅甸采访，但是看了好多东西，其实都很类似。比如说你要去采访反抗军，那但是反抗军那通常就是你就跟着他，然后去看这些战争啊、战事等等的，或者是他在加入反抗军之前他做什么，然后后来就加入反抗军之后他做了什么，其实很多故事会一样。但是我觉得，其实刚才 Thompson 也提到，就是在那个乌克兰战争的时候，现在乌克兰战争的时候，其实也是一样。对于记者来讲，到了后面我们要怎么样去找出一些更有人性化的角度？比如说我自己在想说，那我在反抗军的军营里面，那我想要知道，因为我就是有在观察，里面有人，比如说他们结婚了，就是像这种比较不一样的故事，我自己是希望用这样的方式来带出这些人在战争下面，他们仍然必须要生活，他们仍然要结婚，他们仍然要出去买东西，他们仍然要过生活。所以我自己给我自己的期许是，可以找出一些比较特别的角度，当然来解释这场战争的现在发生的状况。然后回答就是这位先生的问题呢，其实跟 Thompson 讲的差不多，就是军队的文化。其实，在看那个香港反送中的时候，那时候我自己也有这样的问题，说为什么他们打得下去？为什么他们可以做出这些这么暴力的行为？尤其是你们其实是每天生活在一起，你们在同一个城市、同一个国家。然后，如果你脱下警服、脱下军服，其实你就是隔壁的路人甲，你是同样香港人或者缅甸人。在我采访一些就是缅甸政变之后，我有采访1、2位从军队里面逃出来的缅甸军人，他们的解释是说，因为在军队里面，其实就像汤姆森讲，它里面是有自己的一个文化， 然后那个文化就是会 push 这些人必须服从，而且必须去做。有些人他们是没有太多想象，因为他们就从这里面就一直在这里面生活，所以他不会有太多的反思。但是有些人呢，他就会觉得有的时候太超过了，然后有的时候我不想去做，所以才在刚刚有提到，其实现在的逃兵是越来越多的，因为在刚开始可能他们想说，这可能只有一下子而已，可能就是半年或者几个月，但是现在已经过了2年多、2年半，甚至快要3年，我觉得有越来越多人开始受不了这样子的状况，因为他必须要昧着自己良心继续做，然后甚至有很大的高压，从他的长官或者从他的其他的同僚给予他的压力，大概是。
来，还有没有？好，来两位，你先啊，你先，然后接着你啊 ，OK， 介绍一下自己吧。
谢谢2位的精彩分享。我是英国卫报的记者，我叫林启慧。那我想请问你们2个，就是在你们的过去的报道经验当中，你们在这种冲突地区的报道，你们有做了哪些就是对于你们人身安全有帮助的准备，来让自己可以就是安全的离开？谢谢。
活着才能够报道，对不对？好，来，丽丽。
你好，天下杂志陈一山啊，我想请问一下 Thompson， 就是说，我想现在实际上缅甸就是进入一个战争状态。我好奇的是说，因为看起来我们这边比较容易接触到的是反抗军，那从某个角度来看，政府军的报道或政府军的讯息是不是有被 fair 的呈现？我想问这个问题，谢谢。
这个问题是真的吗？我们比较容易接触到反抗军吗？
的确，我觉得国际媒体的确是容易一点拿到反军方的消息。但是军人那边也不太难，因为他们每天有一个 Global Newsline， 仰光缅甸星光报，就每天军方的消息他们也会放出去，所以我们写缅甸的记者也会每天会看他们说什么。所以很多其实你不可以信的，他们比如说他们想在Naypyidaw建一个铁路，我们就说你真的疯了嘛？但是他们就会很多他们自己想的，他们想说的也会出来说。因为今天他们跟我说是 on the record， 所以可能有些details 就不好意思说。我觉得保护自己来说，作为记者最重要是这个 digital security 也是蛮重要的。所以我当年有一个 training， 就是你怎么样去采访也好，你见有些比较敏感的人士，比如说军方的人士，就一定要很小心人家对你的手机什么。所以我有一个 training， 就是说如果你要进去这个meeting， 他们要求你放下手机的话，你问我就，如果当时在仰光我就不做算了，因为如果我放下手机给你，我不知道你会对我手机做什么。就有些比较我觉得比较 standardized 的我们很多同业同行也认识。那你问我怎么样可以其他的方法安全的报道，就很多有时候也是 common sense 的。我有士兵去要我的计程车停下来，就问我是什么，然后你就当然你就很明显你不可以跟他说，哎，我的就你会想办法让他们放你，就不会这么you will find a way to let down their guard and let you go. That's all I can say.
对，就是我跟 Thompson 比较不一样，是因为他那时候已经在缅甸待很久，然后我们是要进去的，所以要进去之前呢，其实因为现在最近台湾有越来越多这样子的训练，就是教记者该如何保护自己进去一些冲突地区之前，其实一个最简单的就是你要有2只手机跟2个电脑，一只手机就是真的你自己用的手机，另外一只手机就是空白的，就是 format 过的，然后电脑其实也是一样。尤其在你在进去这些地方的时候，你要带的就是公务手，就是空白的那只手机，因为你原本的手机，刚才 Thompson 也提到，里面有很多的 contact， 如果有 NUG 的 contact， 那就完了，或者有 Thompson 的 contact， 那就完了。所以这些手机就不会带进去，但是所以你带的东西就是你进去，然后写完，然后把这些东西上传云端，然后再把它删掉。对，这个是保护自己也保护你的 source， 保护你的朋友的一个很重要的方法。 然后因为其实缅甸现在，哦对，刚才也有问 Thompson 这个问题，我们还可以进去吗？我们现在进去可以做到什么样的程度？因为我还不知道，我现在就是政变之后我没有进去过。只不过目前自己看起来，它并不像是在那个乌克兰这样子这么前线，你必须要拿那个 Level 4的那个防弹背心或是头盔等等。因为其实就算是你去跟反抗军采访的话，他们通常也不会真的把你带去前线，他顶多就是在他的军营里面，然后让你采访他们，然后你出来这样。所以这样子的。其实就是你要找人来保护你啦，讲简单一点，你不可能自己一个人进去，你要有 local 的认识的，无论是 fixer 或是你的朋友，或是一些对你比较友好的人，你自己进去的话，在缅甸目前其实是刚才提到有很多的记者被抓被杀，所以这些是真的会发生的。对，我觉得大概是这样。
I think I'll just quickly follow up on this since we have a lot of journalists in the room today. I think they're mostly free types, so I'm not in a position to advise how you go, whether you go, so please bear that in mind. I know people who would go in as a tourist and then do whatever they need and get out and then publish the stories. Of course, that carries a lot of risk if they found out you're actually doing your own reporting. The second type is you follow one of the junta's arranged press trips. So it's safe, you follow, you meet some of the officials in a tightly controlled environment. So it's almost North Korean style. And I think recently we actually had a bit of a controversy because one of the Foreign Correspondents Club of India's chairman went on behalf of the FCC to one of the junta trips, and they had a big meeting with all the ministers. And also that is the moral question about whether you are actually lending legitimacy to the regime as well. And also you can't see much. You are seeing a very tightly controlled, that everything is fine, photo opportunity. The third type, which I have contacts who have done it before, is to go to the border. I have journalist friends who flew into Thailand and go to the border and really enter Myanmar from there. But that is the most colorful and meaningful of the three types, but that also carries risk because those are conflict zones. So if they start the airstrike, then you have nowhere to go. So, and also there's a risk of ethnic armed groups and the Thai military and the Myanmar military going after you. So I think it's not an easy decision to make. I think many news outlets have to weigh the options and risks.